Farmor er hippie. Farmor er hippie. Nei, ønsker hun var. Hun elsker mange, men mest bestefar. Hun tegner et tegn, make love not war, spiller luftgitar med blomster i hår. Kjole som flagrer, kropp som er naken, takker min Gud, jeg ser ikke baken. Hun plukker sin sopp, koker pussig te, og ser mot månen. En ost faller ned. Osten må lagres en Jarlsberg, se her. Musene danser, de vet hvor den er. Så hviler hun seg på moskus skinnfell, som savner sin kjæres på Dovrefjell. Moskus skinnfellen, sen sommer og vin. Kvelden er sliten, men farmor er fin. Jeg elsker farmor og klassisk gitar, blomster og bier og tippoldefar. Hun danser barføtt i spisestuen. Smågrønne popcorn tar av seg luen. De hilser og flirer og smiler og ber. Herre min Gud, jeg må snakke med Per, tenker farmor. Per er altså min gamle psykiater. Så ler de igjen for latterkick. Smågrønne jævler og trekkspillmusikk. De knurrer og viser løvetenner. Per, du må snakke med popcornvenner, tenker farmor. Farmor min flipper og mister seg selv. Hun hyler og bæder barføtt i kveld. Aldri mer popcorn i gryte med hamp. Det drikkes rødvin og lyttes til vamp. Hun fyrer sin blås og røyker sin rev. Et underlig blikk. Hun har pisseskev. Hun glemmer seg selv, blir munter og rar. Så vitser hun om gamle farfars far. Sølvpilen kommer fra Ville Vesten. Ridende vil han bli med på festen. Her er ingen fest, farmor hun fjaser. Så ser hun syner, en schæfer som laser. Nå snakker farmor med meg og seg selv. Gali Mathias og sensommer kveld. Himmel som lyser, måne som spinner. Farmor sin rev tar fyr og forsvinner. Farmor blir farmor og turen over. Nå tror jeg jammen farmor min sover. Takk.
Tusen hjertelig takk til Målfri Fram Jensen, som ville komme her og åpne vår første temauke i år 2000 om rusens nytte og historie. Målfri sin bok, som hun leser fra, heter «Farmor er hippie». Den er veldig grei å lese i, og faktisk har hun med seg 4 X, så dere kan få kjøpe etterpå signert. Og når det gjelder bøker, når vi først er på det, så vet jeg også at Kenneth Mo har med bøker, og at det er mulig å kjøpe signerte utgaver av det åpenbare etterpå. Våre 2 tilreisende gjester, de har ikke med egne bøker, men de vil nok snakke utførlig om hvordan dere kan få fatt i de. Til dere som ikke har vært her før, velkommen til KK, et kafébasert litteraturhus i Stavanger. Vi åpnet opp sesongen 2017 forrige uke. Vi åpnet selvsagt med en debatt om Trump og hva som vil skje med verden. Det var tjokka fullt hus her. Dagen etterpå så delte vi ut Kverulantkatedralens hederspris fra 2016 til de skamløse jentene som vant den prisen som for første gang var blitt nasjonal. Han var på 25 000 kroner, og jeg håper ikke de drikker han opp, det gjør de neppe. Men bruker han til noe fornuftig, det sa de at de skulle nemlig lage et seminar som fortsatte det gode arbeidet de har på gang for nasjonen. Jeg vil minne om i morgen, dette er jo en temauke, Rusens historie og nytte skal vi snakke om hver eneste dag på forskjellig vis. I morgen handler det om krig og rus. Lukács Kamjenskij er da hovedinnleder, et strålende panel med Brita Strand Ragnes, Bård Mæland fra Misjonshøgskolen kommer, og Harald Birkevold skal være programleder. Veldig, veldig bra. Lukács Kamjenskij kom med en bok i fjor om rusmidler i krig, en slags kulturhistorie det også. Og i fjor kom jo også boka til Norman Åhler som på norsk fikk titlen Hitlers rus, om rusbruken hos folket, hos soldaterne og hos Hitler selv i fjor. En skakende beretning om, og en ny måte å forstå krigen på faktisk, og hvordan det kunne vare så lenge. Lørdag skal vi avslutte med en aktuell debatt her i Norge. For en uke 2 siden så skrev Anders Danielsen Lie en kronikk i Aftenposten, der han snakker om den rusliberale skravleklassen som vil lage legemidler av all narkotikaen vi har. Vi spør i stedet rett og slett, det ikke på tide nå at medisinsk cannabis også tas mer i bruk i Norge, ikke minst overfor pasienter med kroniske smertelidelser. Det blir en pasienthistorie og et veldig, veldig bra panel. Nok om det i dag, Rusens historie og nytte. And from here on, I think I have to move into the English language. And all being said about the history and use of drugs from now on this stage will be in English. I hope that is good. And I am to introduce today's host, who is the leader of a quite new organization in the drug field in Norway. It is an organization for, I think it's called in English, the Organization for a More Safe and Knowledge-Based Drug Policy in Norway. Already a kind of critique there, I think. And the host tonight is as well a politician for Venstre, I think in Bergen. Is that correct? Not anymore, not anymore. Okay, anyway, please welcome today's host, Ina Spinnanger.
Hello. Is my mic? Oh, it is great. Okay, everybody, thank you so much and welcome to all of you. I've really been looking forward to this evening, and I'm sure you have too. And the reason is very simple. We're going to talk about drugs. And if there is one thing I really love, it is to talk about drugs. And no matter what you think, if you hate drugs, you love drugs, you hate to love drugs, or you love to hate drugs, I'm sure you're going to find this evening interesting. And we are also very lucky tonight because we're going to have 3 speakers, 3 different writers. Our main speaker today is Stuart Walton. And then we're going to have Kenneth Moe and Lukas Kamienski to give their comments on his speech. We're going to have a short but very magical and great break for about 5 minutes before we're going to have a panel discussion. And I'm going to ask my questions first, and then I'm going to let you ask afterwards. So if you have any questions, just write it down, and I'm sure you're going to have the opportunity during the night to have your questions asked. Okay, I'm very proud to introduce our main speaker tonight, Stuart Walton. Stuart Walton is a cultural historian, philosopher and author of Out of It, a cultural history of intoxication, originally published in 2001, appearing in 2016 as a fully reversed second edition ebook under the title Intoxicology. He has spoken at a number of international conferences on the culture of intoxicants and on drug legalization, including a United Nations gathering in Rimini, and most recently at the University of Warwick in England. His other books include A Natural History of Human Emotions and In the Realm of the Senses, a materialist theory of seeing and feeling, as well as a novel, The First Day in Paradise. At least I want to read all 3 of them, but I would especially like to read The First Day in Paradise. He is also a restaurant critic and a wine writer. His talk tonight will offer a historical difficult with English. Historical philosophical thank you, approach to the role that intoxication have played in human history, from Paleolithic times to the present day. So thank you very much. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Ian. Am I on? Yes. I'm not going to try and say philosophical in Norwegian, as that would be. I'm going to help myself to what I assume is schnapps. The barman in my hotel this evening told me that 100 years ago there was a period of alcohol prohibition in Norway, as there was in the United States. And you can imagine my relief to hear that that's now over. And I began my book on intoxication with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche from a book of 1882 called The Joyful Science, in which Nietzsche asks, who will ever relate the history of narcotics? It is almost the history of culture, of our so-called higher culture. And this is what made me want to look into the role that intoxicants and intoxication have played in founding human cultures through the ages. If we go right back to the even before primeval times and ask ourselves where intoxication comes from, the answer is probably that it comes from outer space. There is still a large haze of alcohol. In fact, there are several of them in the form of giant clouds of molecules. The nearest one to us is about 6,500 light years away. It's called W3, rather unromantically. There's also one at the center of the Milky Way called Sagittarius B2, which is 26,000 light years away from Earth. But what they are clouds of mixed ethanol, methanol, and vinyl alcohol. Ethanol, or otherwise known as ethyl alcohol, is the kind that we can safely drink up to a point. But they're very simple amalgams of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the theory is now that molecules from these clouds once formed into dust particles which would have been carried through the galaxy on the icy heads of comets. And sooner or later, when the ice on the head of the comet melted at very high speeds, the dusts were released and may well have been what seeded the first primitive organic compounds on Earth, and in the process generated the chemical process of fermentation. However that may be, the first accidental encounter with intoxicants among our ancestors must have been of materials that had been naturally fermented, fruit that had fallen off trees, the sap of palm trees, honey. Why were we drawn to it? There is an evolutionary advantage to fermented items in that they generate energy within the body by means of intracellular transfer. They generate an enzyme called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And what that does is it transforms the chemical energy from food molecules into something that assists the metabolic system. ATP generates the energy for just about all our activities. However, fermented foods and drinks are only very weak agents of this process. And to cut a long story short, that makes it quite difficult to argue that consuming fermented items is a biological necessity, that it's essential to survival. It isn't. But we can now see all around the world that animals in the wild will deliberately seek out spoiled fruit. And so did we. We can only conclude, therefore, that this was primarily for its effects rather than because of any nutritive benefit it might have had. And indeed, there are some people who think that the first crops to be grown, which inaugurated the Neolithic revolution at around 10 or 9,000 BCE, were not of foods, but of intoxicants such as tobacco, possibly. What construction, how were intoxicated states interpreted by their earliest subjects? Well, it depends on the substance and the type of intoxication, but in the very broad class of materials of inebriating or hypnotic or hallucinogenic classes, so by that I'm including everything from alcohol to psychotropic mushrooms, cacti, cannabis, even pure leaf tobacco. would have created a sense in those who were experiencing them of stepping outside habitual consciousness, perhaps of becoming somebody else or something else, of contact with cosmological powers, entering another realm, either parallel to this one or else completely removed from it, before gradually returning to the normal one. So that rhythm of flight and return is written into the experience of intoxication from the very earliest times. It's a controlled release from the bonds of the present, which is then incorporated into everyday experience. This has been both a gift to humanity, as I hope to show, and also a curse, in the sense that to this day there is still a temptation to see intoxication as something other than what we should ideally naturally be, something apart from us, to which any access is a matter of dangerous self-indulgence, as opposed to what we could do, which is accord it a place in the overall repertoire of universal human experience. It has been suggested that intoxicants, particularly hallucinogenic materials, might lie at the origin of all mystical belief and supernatural perception, perhaps even of the idea of divinity itself. If primordial terror didn't first require magic mushrooms, they nonetheless undoubtedly deepened and complicated those metaphysical beliefs that a terrifying world had already brought into being. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the ritualistic use of such things in two different historical contexts. But before they became institutionalized into ritual practices, the visionary states that intoxicants produced were accorded an objectified external reality of their own by the user, who of course didn't understand what was happening to him or her. The question is whether all religious ritual is derived from such experiences, or whether ritualistic practices would have developed anyway as a means of soliciting the aid of natural forces, and then intoxicants, drugs were amalgamated into these beliefs and practices in order to help the celebrants communicate more directly with the gods or the forces of nature. But even when ritualized, psychoactive states were understood as a parallel reality to which the agents provided by nature in the form of these plants provided an entry. What this sets up in humanity as a species is an abiding struggle between the instinct to preserve the self and the impulse to suspend it, to lose it. And this is duplicated in every individual's development from childhood into maturity. To maintain a stable, unified self is a great effort, and it remains so throughout our lives. What the experience of altered states does is they hold out the possibility that there is another mode of living to the one we wake up in each morning. That might be a happier life ultimately, but it's precisely that feeling, it's the temptation that altered states lead us onto, that is then considered so dangerous to civilized life, because what civilized life otherwise requires is a more or less willing surrender to compulsion, to labor, to duty, to obedience. If love and works of art and religious belief represent the goals that are in the middle distance to which we could be aspiring, casting a saving light on the present life and illuminating the way out of it, intoxicated states represent a much more direct and immediate way of achieving that redeemed life, because they're already there, they're readily available, they work every time, again up to a point. But it's for that reason that they became seen in human history as first sinful and then immoral, and now of course finally illegal. Psychoactive substances at the dawn of civilization, when they became a universal sacrament rather than the exclusive preserve of a caste of priests, were both spiritual and social. if they allowed a glimpse of the divine, they also strengthen the bonds between one individual and another, uniting people in a common state of altered consciousness. It might just be that all meaningful human togetherness, by which I mean not just simple cooperation, but the depths of love and mutual understanding, are the result of altering consciousness in a physical way. For this reason, they're not only one of the central supports of symbolic ritual, but of culture itself, of the complexities of social development, the making of war, as we'll hear tomorrow, the celebration of peace, the most elevated achievements of the arts, and so on. They point the way beyond the present life to one that could be different, which is why people keep returning to them, and why they belong to the whole of humanity. This is a point that should be borne in mind when it comes to assessing, as Ina briefly touched on, not just the legitimacy, but the moral justice of legal restrictions on their use, which have gradually, of course, grown into a network of repressive global law over the last century. So I'm going to give a couple of historically specific examples. The only substantial example of ritualistic use of any psychoactive substance other than alcohol in the European context took place at the Temple of Eleusis in ancient Greece. Originating around 1500 BC, its practice spanned 2,000 years through the zenith of classical Athens to the time of the Emperor Constantine and then the ascendancy of the established Christian church in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eleusinian Mysteries, as they've come to be known, were a vast 10-day ritualistic celebration attended by thousands of people every year in a temple to the west of the city of Athens. They were held only once a year in September in honor of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and her daughter, to acknowledge another bountiful harvest time, much like the modern European wine festivals still do. The festival climaxed with an all-day procession from Athens to the temple, culminating in a nighttime ritual in which new initiates would be enrolled into the cult. A sacramental cup was shared by everybody who was there. Something was drunk from it. What was it? The question has been the focus of much academic debate. Officially it remains unsettled, but we're coming towards a sort of common view of what it probably was. It was called in Greek kykion, and descriptions of the ritual in both Greek and later Roman writers, including Homer and Cicero, leave us in no doubt that the celebrants underwent a hallucinatory experience. They saw astonishing visions and entered a state of ecstatic consciousness, the memory of which persisted indestructibly throughout the rest of their lives. They felt they'd left the everyday world of travail far behind, and that a joyful life was not just an elusive target, but could be a real and present possibility. A large number of the principal philosophers and writers of classical Athens, as well as Roman royalty during the imperial era, had at least one experience of the Eleusinian ritual, including the great tragic playwrights Aeschylus and Sophocles, the poet Pindar, Aristotle, even Plato, who found himself perhaps more attuned to hallucinogenic intoxication than to the base vulgarity of alcohol. At the conclusion of the Mystery Night, after much exhilarated dancing and celebration had gone on under the influence of the sacrament, the Eleusinians assembled in an internal enclosure within the temple complex. And at the bidding of the officiating priest, a burst of fire poured forth from behind the one great door in the enclosure. And as it swung open, an apparition of the goddess Demeter would appear, dressed in purple. She would appear to the gathering. It all sounds a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, quite frankly, but I think obviously much more elevated. It's almost impossible to imagine the effect that this would have had on sensibilities of people who were far less skeptical, far less intellectual than Plato or Sophocles. There were fainting fits, there were outbreaks of helpless joy, gibbering hysteria were all common. And as the goddess withdrew again behind the door, the whole thing ended with the priest holding up a single grain of cereal to the whole band of the initiates to let them know that they had been initiated into the cult. The most favoured theory that we've arrived at now over the years is that what they were ingesting was ergot, which is a fungus, as you probably know, that parasitically attacks cereal grasses, in particular rye, but also wheat and barley. And it forms little hard purple nodules inside the ear of the grain and displaces the seeds. It's massively toxic if it's swallowed. What happens for people who have inadvertently swallowed it is that it has a stupefying and disorienting effect. It would doubtless have first been observed in cows or sheep that had eaten them. But sustained consumption of ergot produces traumatic obstruction of the bloodstream, resulting in entire limbs becoming useless, and finally rotten with gangrene. It kills you in the end, and quite quickly. Outbreaks of ergot poisoning have bedeviled farming communities over the centuries from time to time, usually because the fungus wouldn't have been noticed. The grain was crushed and then it was baked into bread, which people then ate. Now, since Demeter was the goddess of grain, the goddess of agriculture, the sacrament that was taken at the Eleusinian ceremonies would certainly have been grain-based rather than a wine preparation, and wine was in any case specifically forbidden. If the intoxication that proceeded from it was as psychotropic as the written accounts insist, it seems likely that what they were drinking was some form of ergot beer, or possibly just a mixture of the infected grain with water, and maybe handfuls of mint to make it taste nicer. Now, some people have argued that what undermines that theory, obviously, is on the not unreasonable grounds, is that if it had been systematically used in that way over 2,000 years, there would have been at some point a recorded outbreak of mass toxicity, and yet there are none. One argument is that a probable explanation for the hallucinatory, visionary quality of the experience lies in the fact that the celebrants had traditionally fasted for several days before the night of the mystery. They'd not eaten. And so that in that state, and perhaps mesmerized by the nature of the mass spectacle, their first taste of alcohol, even if it was only a normal beer, would have been very dramatic. That is a practical possibility, but it seems quite a feeble explanation to account for the reactions of someone like Cicero, who candidly says in his report that what happened to the communicants at Eleusis provided a means for living in unalloyed happiness. That seems a bit strong to me as a description of drinking on an empty stomach. And in any case, it would hardly account for the fact that the mysteries were a closely guarded secret procedure. If all they amounted to was drinking after not eating, then the more learned among them would have guessed what the explanation was. And it would have been possible to replicate it. Of course, in everyday life, you wouldn't have needed to go to the temple to do it. But it seems that over 2,000 years, nobody compared the Eleusinian ecstasy to that experience. So briefly to summarize, how do we explain the non-toxic effects of it, if that is indeed what they were consuming? Some people have argued that if you took it in very low concentrations and only very occasionally, it might not be particularly dangerous. But that seems to me a triumph of hope over probability, because somewhere along the line, in 2,000 years, there would have been a large-scale disaster. For example, a single outbreak of ergotism from poisoned rye bread in the French district of Aquitaine in the 10th century killed 40,000 people. There is no such thing as a slight case of ergot poisoning. As I mentioned, your arms and legs literally drop off, and it kills you within days. The two persuasive theories for it are, one, that we know that the grain that went into the cups was specifically barley rather than rye. And it turns out that the strain of ergot to which barley plays host is significantly lower in toxins than rye ergot. Secondly, and this may well go hand in hand with that first point, soaking the grains in water effectively separates the psychotropic alkaloid from the toxic alkaloid, which dissolves in fat. So when we then take into account the fact that the preparation of the sacrament was done to a very closely guarded recipe, it seems that some understanding of how to consume ergot safely had probably come about. But when the temple was destroyed, the last ritual use of hallucinogenic substances in Europe was buried in the rubble. The last pagan emperor of Rome, Julian, tried to revive it. And indeed, he was the last Roman emperor to be initiated into the cult. But he was only emperor for 2 years. And his reign came in what had already been 50 years of Christian government. And of course, Christianity was very strongly opposed to this sort of ritual. And the temple was officially closed down in about the 390s of the Common Era. When the European voyages of discovery then started in the Middle Ages, the European colonialists came upon primitive societies all over the unknown world that had incorporated the use of drugs into their religious rites, symbolic practices, and indeed their social lives. Psychotropic mushrooms, cacti, tree barks, seeds, resins, alkaloids were everywhere, gleaned from nature in a mythologized and largely forgotten antiquity, but now being used as agents of group solidarity and cultural elaboration and indeed spiritual insight. When the European colonists discovered these indigenous intoxication rituals, they made an immediate attempt to eradicate them with varying degrees of success. In 16th century Mexico, the Spanish Inquisition began by dismissing the natives' belief in peyote, which is the natural plant source of mescaline, as a mere superstition. It was used in tribal societies for predicting the future, so they rubbished that. But they also interestingly denied that the plant had any sort of psychoactive effect, saying that these ecstatic states that the users went into were purely imaginary. I'd briefly quote from a church report of 1620, which said, this is a Spanish church report, in English, "Neither the said herb nor any other can possess the virtue or inherent quality of producing the effects claimed, nor can any cause the mental images, fantasies, or hallucinations on which these divinations are based. In these latter are plainly perceived the suggestion and intervention of the devil." But if the effects were purely imaginary, why would you need to ban it? It seems unlikely that the Inquisition's officers on the ground believed the official line. They could see for themselves that the intoxicated state was not faked. But in any event, peyote proved difficult to control. Not only did the indigenous peoples cling to it, but the ones who were semi-converted to some version of Catholic Christianity managed to effect a compromise in which peyote was incorporated into Christian ceremonial. By the end of the 17th century, a group called the Coahuila in northern Mexico had successfully incorporated the Catholic notion of the patron saint into their own devotion to peyote. They called him El Santo de Jesus Peyotes. And both the naming and the ritual practice of blessing the peyote cuttings at an altar were enough to persuade the inquisitors that the Christian god's influence had taken root. Sometimes the Peyote Jesus, it was said, who was also known as El Santo Niño de Peyotes, could be glimpsed by the indigenous people hovering among the cactuses, which he loved and cared for. He'd been completely incorporated into local ritual. Ritual hallucinogenic use, also closer to home, came to light among tribal peoples in Siberia, for some of whom the Amanita muscaria mushroom species was very highly prized. It was used as currency, but it was also used as an intoxicant, of course. When the Russians first encountered these tribes in the 17th century, they were shocked and puzzled by the strange behavior that the consumption of the mushrooms caused in the people. They were dried and eaten, or else they were boiled up into a kind of soup. The most repulsive aspect of this to the Cossacks was that after the hallucinatory state began to fade off, the tribesmen would urinate into a bowl and then either drink the contents himself or offer them to one of his friends. Urine drinking was also encountered towards the end of the 19th century among a native group in what's now Washington State in the northwest corner of America called the Coast Salish. They were distant descendants, of course, of the first migration from Siberia across the Bering Strait in about 10,000 BCE. The explanation for this strange behavior has only been provided relatively recently, when it's been shown that amanita, as well as other hallucinogenic materials, remains active in the urine, albeit at lower potency. It also works incidentally with ecstasy. Really don't ask me how I know that. Finding the whole thing deeply disgusting, the Russians attempted to suppress the mushroom trade in Siberia, but failed. And even when they introduced distillation, as in home vodka production, not all the inhabitants obediently started drinking spirits. The ones that did steeped dried mushrooms in the spirit and then drank that instead, and then drank their own piss. Prior to the era of medical concern, psychoactive materials belonged to anybody who had the means to procure them. It was accidentally discovered in the 19th century that opium, an ancient pain-relieving panacea, when smoked or tinctured in alcohol as laudanum, produced at a certain critical mass a state of visionary narcosis, for which property it was, of course, invested by writers and artists of the Romantic generation, with the quality of a creative catalyst. In 1799, the English scientist Humphrey Davy sat in the Avon Gorge, a large, deep valley in western England, in the dead of night, out of his skull on nitrous oxide, otherwise known as laughing gas, and dreamed that a reconciled world might come about if everybody took this instead of drinking alcohol. In the 1840s in Paris, hashish would trigger the same kind of hopes that, we could all produce wonderful poetry and painting and great philosophical insight if we deliberately altered our states of consciousness. The quest was to see what uses these states might be put to beyond simple entertainment. But if the classical period in Greece and Rome marks a sort of watershed when intoxicants pass from being central to devotional ritual to become an aspect of social conviviality, there is a similar transition period, I've argued, in the 19th century, when intoxicated states turn from being the inspiration for creative work, transports of the soul, into being purely recreational, in the sense that alcohol had long been. If you're not a poet or a painter, and you don't necessarily consider your soul to be in need of transporting, beyond going to church every week, what intoxicants then returned to was what they had always potentially been in prehistory, before any symbolic meanings were attached to them, which were a means of altering your state of consciousness just for its own sake. And this is what gradually happened to all the substances that had been divorced from their original cultural contexts: cannabis, coca, opium, they became instruments of pleasure for their own sake in Western industrial societies, especially where, as with coca and opium, they were concentrated into their active alkaloids, as cocaine and morphine, or as semi-synthetic derivatives such as heroin. And what that led to culturally is the question of whether people have the right of access any longer to these states of consciousness, and what the proper response of state authorities ought to be when uncontrolled use of them begins to create growing medical problems. It was the developing awareness and medical theorizing of physical addiction in the 19th century that led to the first attempts to find magic bullet cures for it. Morphine was initially put forward as a cure for cocaine addiction. Heroin was then proposed as a solution to the morphine addiction that the morphine used to cure cocaine addiction had created. When all that failed, the medical attempt to control it was then displaced by a legislative process which represented an ultimately fateful attempt to cut off the supply of them to civil society altogether. And I've argued that the greatest conspiracy ever mounted against the mass of humanity, greater than organized religion, greater than capitalism, greatest because it's so enormously ambitious in its effort, is the attempt to close off access to alternative mental states. The past century of obsessive legislating, much of it under the auspices of the United Nations and its precursor, the League of Nations, some of it at the behest of successive administrations in Washington, is only the blink of an eye in the context of historical time. But its roots lay in the medicalizing of intoxicated states, which began in the later 19th century, and with which the legal restrictions then proceeded, hand in hand. If the thought is that if the excessive and dysfunctional use of intoxicants could be shown to be a matter of whatever demonic power they contained within them, which had the potential to entrap the feeble-minded, weak-willed, criminally predisposed, naively curious people, savages, juveniles, idiots, women, only entire removal of the means of access to them could free society of the worst aspects of intoxication. And that was to be achieved, as you all already know this, but it went from only permitting licensed medics and pharmacists to dispense them, then by prohibiting the attempt to sell them on even where you had legitimately bought them, then by criminalizing mere possession of them. And the result has been a widespread public health catastrophe, the encouragement of a global black market racket founded on the exploitation of impoverished farmers, ruthless gang networks prepared to kill indiscriminately to protect their territories, the criminalization of blameless citizens, and an entirely unregulated street trade, often selling fatally toxic materials to its eternally trusting customers. So in short, intoxication in the last century has hit rock bottom. If it once pointed the way to transfigured consciousness, what the message of today's hyper-legislation and relentless medical propaganda is that it's always either a critical problem or it's well on the way to becoming one. While mass culture and the pop philosophy of self-help books are endlessly fond of telling the citizen of the global economy to dream big, never give up on your dreams, follow your dreams wherever they take you, on the grounds that anything can happen if you want it enough, all the way to becoming a millionaire or a megastar, President of the United States, the means that have actually lain at the disposal of ordinary people throughout human history, by which consciousness is much more readily transformed than simply by dreaming, have been turned into something that can only make him or her unhappy or unwell. This is an attempt nothing less than anthropological engineering, and has produced one of the great administrative disasters ever visited on free people. So to conclude, what we have to relinquish is the notion that intoxicants are the recourse people have for supplying a lack. There must be something missing in your life if you're drawn to getting off your faith. Adorno, the German philosopher, in his late work on aesthetics, says that there's quite a strong comparison to be made between art and intoxicants. But he says that although the impact of some artworks can be intoxicating, the feeling is nothing compared to the pleasure of actual drunkenness. He was the son of a Frankfurt wine merchant. The use of it is that moralistic use that we get drunk or stoned or wired, whatever, because we're trying to fulfill a lack, that we're trying to compensate for the inadequacy of life, is a culturally specific idea of the last 150 years that to me is already outdated and has to go. But it's still a very strong cultural trait. Carl Jung said, every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or morphine or idealism. So finally then, a lot of energy has been expended in the last century on what a post-antagonistic society in a sort of liberated political situation might look like. There would be an end of economic relations that defined individuals by their function in an exchange system. There might be an end of armed conflict. Lukas can tell us about that, the likelihood of that tomorrow. It may even be that the notion of romantic love would wither away. We wouldn't need it anymore. What about intoxication? Will there come a point where we don't feel the need to do it anymore? It depends. If drugs are only there to provide the illusion of an escape from a dreary reality, would they evolve away too in a happier state of society? Not a chance, in my view. If the alteration of consciousness is indeed purely about consoling oneself, then there would be lots and lots of occasions in human life where we would still need it to cope with every accident or disappointment or every personal dilemma, every loss of a loved one, and so on. If, on the other hand, it's primarily about feeling happier, feeling better, and that the instinctive desire for it is deeply imprinted in human beings, just as much as the desire for good food and sexual pleasure are, then one can only imagine that a very well-ordered society would provide more time for it. In fact, of course, it's a combination of the two, and therefore doubly indispensable. Even the most intolerant societies can't police personal behaviour all the time. The exemplary executions, summary shootings on the spot, carried out in some Islamic jurisdictions on people caught in possession of alcohol or other drugs, have not succeeded in getting rid of intoxicants from those societies. And it's precisely because the effort to stamp it out runs up against its near universality that it proves both impractical, not to say morally revolting, to keep trying. Even if a new palliative drug were to be found that would neutralize social and political dissent and keep everybody quietly obedient after all, without compromising their health or creating a lifelong dependency, it still wouldn't displace all the others, which go on being available legally and illegally to supply the need that we had already established as we emerged from the caves to change our experience of the world. If drugs are beneficial to human beings, as I've argued they overwhelmingly have been, as when they're used safely and wisely, then it's because they reassure us that the faulty world that we live in could be different. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Thank you very much. So we learned that, you can see. Different drugs have been a part of human nature since the beginning of time, and it's even been beneficial for us. And if I understand you correctly, you also expect different drugs to be a part of our future. Mm-hmm. One reflection is, in English you have this word intoxication, and that gives me associations to toxic or
yes.
Poisoning.
Yes.
And in Norwegian we have a different word, rus, which is more chemical state of mind or change
yes.
in your brain, and
yeah.
can be used not only if you take drugs, but also If you're in love, we have a
Yes.
forelskelsesrus, or a
Yes.
drug intoxication.
Yes.
Or if you are very happy,
Yeah.
we say happy intoxication. Or spenningsrus if you seek adventure. What do you think about the word intoxication? Is it too negative?
It is quite negative, isn't it? No, because in the Latin, in the middle of it, as you rightly say, is toxicum, which is poison. So it's already the official the Latin name for it is telling us that this is something that is bad for us and something that we shouldn't do. And I understand, I think, the Nordic word, which is similar to the German Rausch, which it conveys the same idea of a state of possession, not necessarily by physical means, but also just it can be an emotional state in which you're carried away or possessed in a positive way, is probably a much better word for this group of experiences than something that only refers to poison.
Yes, and I'm just find my question here. I guess you heard about the stone ape theory. The stone ape theory is a controversial theory from Terence McKenna, which states that a lot of our advanced human evolution came from the result of eating magic mushrooms or psilocybin. This theory have been highly criticized, but I still want to ask you if you think that drug use might have had an impact on our evolutionary history at all, and if so, how?
I think it certainly has had an effect on evolution. I don't quite go the full distance that McKenna did, where in a very good book called Food of the Gods, I think originally published in the early 90s, an American ethnobotanist, Terence McKenna, advanced the theory that in evolutionary history, of course, there's this great question of where is the missing link that transports us from being animals into a being which has a consciousness and can think about things and becomes aware of its own life and comes to consciousness of its own. And he says that he thinks it's when our ancestors on the African grasslands first swallowed Stropharia cubensis, which is a hallucinogenic mushroom known as is known as the psilocybin mushroom, and that the experience of that and the self-reflectiveness of that is what then created the intellect and consciousness and the sort of and language and symbolic. I think that's a really big stretch, to be honest, and I'm not sure in one that, of course, it's completely unprovable, and we'll never get there. And so I don't necessarily. I'm trying to draw a more subtle line between saying the reason that everything that's great about human history is just because we all took drugs in the first place. What I'm saying is that the experience of altered states of consciousness, in fact, is what deepens and complicates processes that were already happening in human societies and in culture and in our own state of awareness.
Thank you very much. Here to comment on your speech is Kenneth Moe. He is a young, talented Norwegian writer, born in 1987 in Larvik. He has written 2 autobiographies at Karl Ove Knausgård's publisher Pelikan, and his first book came out in 2015 with the novel Restless in English. He received Tarjei Vesaas Debutantpris, a prize awarded annually for the best Norwegian newcomers. And his second book, Det åpenbare, was about freeing himself, where in this book he also describes a psychedelic trip. Yes, I will let you comment on his speech, and I'll also have a few questions for you afterwards. Thank you.
Hey, whenever I hear people speak for something, I'm against it, and when I hear people talk against something, I'm for it. So I was thinking about.
You're very suggestive.
Yes, very. I was thinking about, you were talking about the right of access to drugs, and how modern societies strive to stop us from doing drugs. And as someone who has tried magic mushrooms, I have to say, I don't want to work. I'm much more inclined to believe in people as ends and not means, not functional but meaningful in themselves. So I want to know if, I think your ending suggested your answer, but I was thinking about the legalization and whether it would cause decadence and total destruction of Western society or not.
No, it wouldn't. The thing about, did you say you thought people were ants when you'd taken magic mushrooms?
What?
You thought they were ants?
No.
Did you say?
Oh, ends as versus means, ends means.
Oh, ends, I'm sorry, I didn't.
No.
Forgive me, excuse me.
The opposite of
No,
ants.
This is why it's a very good idea that altered states don't go on and on and on. They all come to an end. If you take hallucinogenic mushrooms, or even more so with LSD, it feels like it is going on and on and on, that you'll never come out of the other end of it. But ultimately, it's the fact that we can incorporate those experiences into the rest of our lives. No one's saying that, well, certainly I'm not saying, that we can be off our faces all the time. We have to work and look after our kids and all the rest of it. But on the question of legalization, there are two versions of the libertarian argument. One is to say everything should be legal, which is not very popular anywhere. But the other thing is to say that currently illegal substances could be decriminalized. And this is what has now been tried in increasing numbers of countries. I'm sure you're all now familiar with the example of Portugal, which decriminalized all previously controlled substances in 2001. Switzerland has now gone the same way. Uruguay has gone the same way. The city of Vancouver in Canada has done the same thing. Certain states in the US have done it with regard to cannabis. Interesting to see how long that lasts now. But and the effects socially and economically have been even better than those of us who put the libertarian argument could ever have expected. Because and this is quite a complicated, we haven't quite got time to go into the psychology of this, but as soon as you say that no one is going to stop you from doing what you otherwise want to do, then it becomes less urgent to do it. And the situation in Portugal now is that although drugs have not been legalized in Portugal any more than dope was legalized in the coffee shops in Amsterdam, which a lot of British tourists over the years mistakenly thought was the case. What's happened is that nothing bad will happen to you if you take it, or indeed if you've got some on you. You can have something like 5 or 6 grams of cocaine on you now in Portugal, and if you're stopped and searched by the police, they won't arrest you or fine you or charge you. They are still going after the large-scale dealers, which then, of course, raises the question of if they're stopping them, then how could the end user then get hold of it? And with regard to the really noxious things like opiate addiction, the results have been amazing because everybody is now registered with a medical system which is not invasive, it's not overly supervisory. What it is doing is supplying people who need heroin with clean heroin and clean needles, if that's the way they use it. They're not being forced onto methadone if they don't want to do methadone. But everybody knows where they are and what they've got. The supply goes on. Yeah, there is also a system that's encouraging them to get off it, to gradually kind of wean themselves off it at their own pace. But the result is the numbers of the amount of criminal activity that the drug trade generates has been substantially reduced. And the numbers of people dying from heroin addiction, which is to say from infected needles and adulterated drugs, have gone down from hundreds, something like 700 or 800 a year, way out of proportion to the population of Portugal. They've literally gone down to 4 or 5 a year over the course of the 15, 16 years that this policy has been in operation. And just to, they did this in defiance of United Nations, the United Nations Charter on Drugs. They've done it in defiance of European Union restrictions on the sale of narcotics, and they've said we are not going back to the prohibition system.
Wouldn't you say, this is a really leading question, but the rat park experiments that show if rats have a lot of fun stuff to do in their cages, they don't become heroin addicted?
That's right, yes.
Wouldn't you say that it's precisely because we live in such restrictive societies that we need drugs?
Yes, I think so. The sort of stressfulness and the economic privation people have to live with is often what makes you try to make your life look even temporarily more joyful. There is this element. We shouldn't characterize all intoxication in that way, but it is obviously one of the ways in which people medicate their own sense of dissatisfaction. The rat experiment was wrongly founded for years, because it was initially based on you had caged rats that were given a choice of pressing 3 levers, and one lever delivered food to them, and the second one delivered water, and the third one delivered cocaine. And they end up just banging on the cocaine lever all the time until they drop dead of dehydration. This is because they're in a cage. It's nothing about cocaine. It's because they're in a tiny enclosed cage. And when eventually the experiment was repeated, I think in the 1980s, wasn't it? It was quite a long time ago. And the rats were given large enclosures with soft furnishings and music and the chance to meet other rats. They went back to just consuming the food and water.
Should I read now or after? Yeah. I translated a chapter of my book. Ina called them autobiographies. I'm not quite that egomaniac to call my books. They're autobiographical novels, I'd say. I'm not old enough to write my autobiography yet, but at some point maybe. This chapter is called On Solving Unsolvable Problems, and it's I've been walking around. I'm doing magic mushrooms, and I'm walking around in the woods, and at this point I decide to stop. I stop, if only to prove to myself that I'm still capable of stopping, and I look around. Still only trees, but I can hear a bicycle approaching. I hear the wheels closing in. I don't know from which direction. I still can't see it. The sound cleaves my spine, so it's coming from behind me. Too much is happening now. The whole world pours into me. I pour into the world. Up ahead is a slope of stones. I hurry up the slope as the cyclist passes. I sit down on a small outcrop. Why so short of breath suddenly? Oh right, the slope I just climbed. I lie down. The rock is hard against my back. It bulges. I feel every jagged point. Still, I think that now I found my place, that my goal is to stay here for a while, to withstand the mild discomfort if necessary. My shoulders protest. My lower back curves where the rock declines slightly. Gradually, the discomfort turns to pain. I study the pain. I let it be. All the while, more and more of me resists. I am determined to receive the rock without protest. I demand it of myself. It's the only thing I demand. By the way, I now finally know what it means to have or to be a self. First and foremost, that I'm something other than this rock. It's when I try to open myself completely up to the world that the boundary between me and it becomes clear. It is when I try to let go of my own preferences that my taste shows itself in all things, almost like a projection of my own nervous system. Isn't that how it is? That when I try to become another, I am finally myself. That all selves are results of failed attempts at self-transcendence. The questions dissolve quickly, or by asking them, I've transcended them, and I myself dissolve. It is, as I have learned before, by breathing, by asking, that I get further. Never by forcing, not by insisting. It's when I ask questions, by which I mean when I am capable of keeping several things possible at the same time, that my ego and language, my preferences and distinctions start giving way to the oneness of nature. My hands lie folded on my chest. First they dissolve into each other, then my hands disappear into my chest, then my whole chest and the rest of my body disappear further down into the rock. It's as if I trickle down through the cracks like hot cocoa. I and the stone are like a single warm field. I feel no quietude in this state, nor disquiet, more like an undifferentiated buzzing. This is the primeval condition of my impulses, chaotic and free. Only further on up the system, in the higher layers, where words, interpretations, stories are needed, the impulses will take shape as either this or that. I feel this because, and they turn into actions. Thus I have to. Down here in the depths, however, it's clear that every little twitch on the surface is only part of a much larger and far more patient movement that I barely have access to. The distinction between me and the world has gradually dissolved. For everyday use, that distinction is a matter of life and death. But at the same time, it's the basic fallacy behind, and the reason for, our never feeling at home anywhere. And isn't the dream of an uprooting precisely a kind of homesickness? I dream of a break with my own past, which is to say, to become another, precisely so that I can feel, maybe for the first time, that I am at home here and now. But there's nothing that I am now, or ever have been, that I can stop being tomorrow. Nor can I force something new and foreign into the system. The only thing I can do is to open up, see what happens. Only this, breathe, ask, because some problems have no solution. One doesn't solve them, they dissolve.
Thank you. You talked about the rat experiment, and that when they just had a happy life, they didn't need the drug anymore. But do you think that people with a happy life would still seek drugs? And could even, you talked about drugs could be beneficial. Do you think even if you have a happy life, you might want to take drugs?
Yes, because they, as I tried to say towards the end, drugs can be consoling in the unhappy periods, which is where a lot of the problems of dependency emerge from. But they can also be the means that you use to celebrate the fact that things are happy, and otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing in the new year with champagne and seeing out the end of the day's work, with the drink in the early evening. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have to emerge out of a sort of negative consciousness. It can also be the support of positive consciousness as well.
It seems that over the past centuries, different generations have preferred different drugs. In the 1920s and 30s, it was cocaine and heroin, and in the 1950s and 60s, LSD and speed, yes, and then cocaine and ecstasy in 80s and 90s, and now it seems a lot of drugs that are enhancing productivity is increasing. Do you have any thoughts about different drugs from different generations? Do we is it just because it was available at the time, or is it something about our generation that we tend to seek different drugs?
I think that this is a very interesting phenomenon, that different periods do have their own drugs. It does, of course, very much depend on what had become available at the time. But the mistake is always to say that, well, particular periods in society generated the particular kinds of drug experience. In fact, to me, it's exactly the other way around. that whatever intoxicants became prevalent at the time then generated the types of social consciousness and means of celebration that there then were. A colleague of mine has written a very interesting online essay on Eon magazine on precisely this theme. Does each era have its own drug? And I was sort of participating in that with him, but in the discussions of it. But that's my view of it. Is that cocaine, for example, which as you say was very popular in the 1920s, came back in a very big way in the 1980s when it was used famously by investment bankers and futures traders and so on, and was generating all sorts of random economic decisions. But it's the that we're all still living with. But it's the way that cocaine is being used in order to support that style of life, rather than the style of life that produces the drug use. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. We're going to have up our next writer. His name is Lukas Kamienski. He is an associate professor at the Faculty of International and Political Studies in Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. His works concentrates on military technology and on military transformation, the future of war, military profession strategy, and recently biotechnical human enhancement. He is known for at least 3 books, one of the information revolution in military affairs and the transformation of the American way of warfare. He's written about the military applications of the biotechnology revolution and on the future soldier and the history of drug and wars. He is currently working on the potential military applications of genetics, genomics, and genetic engineering as one of the aspects of military human enhancement. But I can assure you, even though he has been reading a lot about drugs and warfare, he is a very peaceful and peace-loving person. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm afraid I'm not going to, I cannot escape from the war issues, and your great presentation only inspired me further. I was first inspired by Stuart after I read his Out of It, when I was researching for my book on the history of drugs in war. And you literally opened my mind that it should be seen in a cultural context. And I have 2 main reflections. I'm sad because I see the parallel between how the intoxication and intoxicants evolved and how warfare and violence evolved. Anthropologists say that there are 3 types of violence. Existential, that is to say, through warfare and through committing violence, you touch your humanity somehow. It gives you a sense of life, it defines you, gives you an identity, etc. Second, there is expressive violence, so you do violent acts to say something to the world, to communicate. And finally, there is instrumental violence, so you use violence to achieve an end. And what Friedrich Nietzsche admired in ancient Greeks was that they could balance these 3 types of violence in their conduct of warfare. And he was very happy, and he was really, really excited about their way of warfare. And what we see throughout the centuries is that this existential violence is giving way to an instrumental one. Of course, it's a complex issue, but technological advancement and social development has much to do with this. And when we look at today's American way of war or Western way of war, we definitely and basically see only instrumental violence. There is very, very little existential element in it.
Yes.
So warfare doesn't define anymore what it means to be man, what it means to be a human being, civilian, etc. Which is sad, and Nietzsche wouldn't like it,
No.
definitely. And back to intoxicants and different practices of intoxication, I see the parallel process. That is to say, we are moving from this word of sacrum that you talked about, and we jump into profanum, which at times becomes highly instrumental. And when you gave this example of ergot and it's used in spiritual, religious rituals, it came to my mind the extreme example of where it ended up. It's not only LSD that was synthesized based on ergot at Sandoz company, but what the military and the intelligence agencies in the United States did with it. That is to say, in the late 1940s, there were reports coming saying that the Soviets are gathering huge amounts of ergot in Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries. And the question was why? Why were they buying all this from the farmers? Why radio stations in Poland and Hungary were announcing, come on, bring your ergot-polluted crops, right? So the CIA came up with the idea they are building a psychochemical weapon. So they are trying to extract LSD out of it and use it against us. What to do? Develop our own psychochemical weapon. And that is how CIA experiments and army experiments with LSD as a potential non-lethal weapon began. These experiments lasted for over 20 years in case of the US Army Chemical Corps, and even longer when it came to the CIA, because they ended in mid-1970s. They included experiments on human beings, informed and non-informed, and the goal was to turn what used to be a means of achieving a transcendental state of consciousness and probably getting closer to the divine into something extremely instrumental.
Yes.
And the recent example, you may heard about the signed cannabis company. It's the local American company which tries to capitalize on the changes in the policy towards cannabis in the US. So in September last year, they issued a patent application to the US Patent Office, and it's called weaponized cannabis. So they actually applied for a patent to turn cannabis into non-lethal weapon that could be used to control crowds and, use against riots, etc. And I love their maxim, if you like, and it goes, stone them all, and let the courts sort them out. It's a true story. You can read it online. You can read about the 4 delivery options, like darts, canisters, and paintballs. They are very specific. But I'm strongly against this kind of idea because it's the end. On the one hand, you've got shiny, happy people smoking weed. On the other hand, you've got police, corps, and probably also the military shooting at them with non-lethal weaponized cannabis. That's crazy, isn't it?
Completely.
And another comment, second comment on your talk. In 2003, we, the humanity, achieved something great. The whole human genome was sequenced. The Human Genome Project succeeded. And the new era of genetics started. So scientists started working and searching for certain genes or mutations of genes that are responsible for who we are, how we look like. So we ended up with genes for everything, from diseases to traits to behavior, etc. I'm not a great speaker because I have a bad mutation of gene, while you are a great speaker because you're genetically gifted. But it's not true.
I'm speaking my own language as well.
Yeah, but it's not true, which is what the second turn of genetics tells us. No. You have to take into account environment, which is obvious. But then there is a new approach coming into play, and it's called epigenetics. And it basically says that within an individual life, environmental impact on our genome can change it, and we can transfer it to next generations. So the conclusion is that both environment and genetics make us. And my reflection is that both culture and intoxication made human beings. So you cannot look at culture and intoxication as a separate. They co-evolved. And the question is, where are we heading in the age of controlled policies and anti-drug restrictions? I'm not that much optimistic that it will go away, not so quickly. Not because governments are not willing to, but we don't probably get into account one important factor. It's a huge global business. It's a global market. It brings something like $300 billion a year. And this business is not going to let decriminalization go easily. And I think I shall end up at this point.
Thank you very much. Before the break, I just have to ask a question for you.
Thank you.
Before our short break, I just have to ask a question to you, Lucas, and it's a bit childish, but I just have to ask: if you had an army, and the goal was to kill as many enemies as possible, and you could only give them one drug, which drug would it be? And if the goal was to create a peaceful movement or peace in a country, what drug would you think would help to create that kind of environment?
What a question. Well, scientifically, uppers are obviously perfect, and the only answer to your first question, well, amphetamine, methamphetamine, and cocaine would be an obvious answer, but they are good in short term, but then, they bring side effects, so you have to wait until you regenerate yourself. An amphetamine hangover, etc. So it's not a good option, and we know it from military history. But there is a new generation of stimulants, and it's called eugorics, good stimulants. That is to say, they work even better than amphetamines, and they have very little or no side effects. At least this is what they say us, what they tell us. And one of this kind of drug is modafinil, trademarked as Provigil, for example, in the US. By the way, it's a lifestyle drug, so 90% of its sale is off-label. It's not used as it's supposed to be used. It's called Viagra for the brain, if you like. And actually, the US military is using it. So it's a good path to go. But I strongly believe that the future belongs not to drugs, but to neurobiology, because there are many effects you can achieve with drugs that you can achieve even better with stimulating your brain. It's called brain-machine interface, or simply transcranial brain stimulation. And the advantages are great. No side effects, longer-lasting effects, less controversies. So this would be my answer to your first question. The second one was about peace. I don't like talking about peace because I do war studies.
What would be the least effective drug if you want peace? Like if you have an army and you give them that drug, they will
There are
go to
lovely movies over the internet with the army, British, American, Czech experiments with LSD. And I recommend you to Google them out, because you see how troops are responding to liquid LSD. They are completely incapable of fighting, doing anything. They are giggling. In one British army experiment, they have to stop the exercises after 20 or 30 minutes because one of the soldiers climbed the tree, and when asked what he's doing, he said, "I'm trying to feed the birds." So LSD might be the answer.
Why is anybody surprised at that result?
So peaceful movements from LSD and effective warriors from stimulants. And yes. Thank you very much. We're going to have a short break. Yeah?
I think it's a little too late for the break now.
Okay.
Should have been earlier. Maybe we should
Questions? Yes. Okay, then we're going to open up for the questions from the audience. We can send around the mic. Do we have another mic? Or?
Yeah.
Yes. Just raise your hand. Not everybody at the same time. Okay, we got one there.
Hi, this one goes to Stuart.
Stuart.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. I'm a politician here, a green politician, local politician, and I'm very fond of. I'm very interested in politics around drugs. I debate it a lot, and I was once a very big fan of prohibition. And after a lot of reading and friends who kind of talked to me about it, reading the Global Commission on Drug Policy and World Health Organization, etc., I've changed my mind, and I'm a big speaker for the end of prohibition, or prohibition on drugs. My question is, you kind of touched this earlier. You were talking about how the psychology of prohibition and how when something is illegal, we are more drawn to it than if it was legal. And a thought struck my mind, which is, like in Norway, we have a very peaceful society. We have a very collective society where we take care of each other. Our welfare state is very strong. Like that rat experiment we were talking about, we have mostly a very good cage.
Yes.
But when we discuss drugs and drug use, just recently in the newspapers we were discussing how, well, we have such low use of cannabis and low use of this and that, but we have a very high overdose death rate on heroin, for example. And the reason why we have such low use of cannabis is because of the prohibition. My argument is exactly the opposite. The rat cage is so good. We are so good at taking care of each other. But my question is, if prohibition was gone, and say one of the debates we're having, if cannabis would become legal, and by legal I mean strongly regulated, would this lead to a higher use? Or would this, kind of in your argument, lead to bigger responsibility on the individual? Because as this is available to me, I can buy this at any time, and this can of course apply to other drugs as well.
Yes.
Will it then be more of a responsibility to my health, as you said, my children, my work, etc., not to go overboard and, oh, this is available, so I can just go nuts?
Yeah.
Long question, but I'm
No,
sure you
but
understand the gist of it.
Yeah, I do. What's happened in the places where they have decriminalised? Portugal has been the longest experiment so far, but when I first put this argument in the first edition of my book, I said very candidly, what would happen if you decriminalise the use of intoxicants is that they will go up because they've now become more legitimately available. And a way has to be found of safely managing that. In fact, what happens is that they do go up, then they go down again to below the level they were when it was illegal. Now the question is, this is repeating itself statistically everywhere this policy has been tried. So the challenge now is to explain that. And I'm slightly, this is very complicated, but I've never quite believed the argument that people take drugs because they're illegal. The old, what used to be called the forbidden fruit argument, that you want it because it. No, most people who do drugs would quite like them not to be illegal. They do it despite the fact that they're illegal, not because of it. And there's often, depending on where you live, you're running the risk of being arrested and busted and fined and losing your job and whatever it is. But there is, however, seemingly an effect whereby if you then decriminalise things, they become less interesting. So it's not that they're more interesting because they're illegal. It's that they're less interesting because they're legal.
The other
or
way
not
around.
legal, but they don't have the same penal tariff applied to them. And because the prohibition has been a very, very recent historical experiment, it's only really 100 years old. It's been an absolute and utter disaster throughout the entire civilized world. We've got as Łukasz was saying, the illegal drug trade is now something like the 7th largest economic trade on the planet. And then people say, well, therefore, if we legalize it, then we're creating even more problems. It's hard to imagine how much worse things would have to get before we say that the present system isn't working. It's having exactly the opposite effect. It is also possible to say that a lot of people don't take drugs because they're illegal. The laws do actually deter a lot of people from going anywhere near drugs, or maybe experimenting with it once when they were a student, and never going near it again. But for people who do want to do it, they won't have it taken off them and so the entire trade in it is completely unregulated. It's in the hands of criminal we know all this. And somehow a way has to be found to back away from that, rather than just making... In Britain, as you may have heard last year, we passed a thing called a letter that someone else came in. We passed a thing called the Psychoactive Substances Act. And very briefly, the logic of that is to say, every time a new substance becomes available, we have to add it to the drug laws. So what this new legislation does is it says everything is illegal. Regardless of what it is, regardless of whether anybody's taken it yet, you can't take anything unless we specifically tell you you can, which is undermining the entire principle on which legal consensus ought to rest.
Thank you very much. Is it okay with a follow-up to Łukasz, since he just to close? Yes.
Very quickly.
Łukasz, witam. Też jestem z Polski.
Really?
Dobry wieczór. I just wanted to ask you, as Stuart touched this, you said that the big criminal organizations do not want prohibition to end, and that is why you are less optimistic and how fast it will go. And my question is kind of a little bit of a conspiracy. Is some of the reason why we have these extreme, that we don't want laws to change, is it because these big criminal organizations are behind trying to control the politicians in some way to say, no, do not accept decriminalization?
Well, I wouldn't subscribe to this. Not yet. I think that the dominating paradigm did enough in terms of the general idea that substances should be controlled and the policies should follow, which was multiplied by the famous war on drugs declared by President Nixon, 1971. So there's the whole system which was constructed and is in action. It's like a kind of machine that is going and it's living its own life. So my argument was that the process of decriminalization, once it starts and achieves its momentum, might meet the obstruction, because, let's be honest, it will be a war, a kind of war.
Like an economic war?
And war as such. Because when you look at the drug cartels, they transformed into paramilitary organizations. So the line between drug cartel and insurgency or terrorist organization has blurred. It's both. FARC is a good example. Al-Qaeda is a good example. Daesh is a good example. So it's not drug cartel per se, what we see today, but it's a hybrid organization which is fluent in violence, which is trained in using violence, and it's not only criminal activity, it's criminal warfare activity. So this is what we should keep in mind.
Thank you.
We were invited this evening to discuss the cultural history of intoxication, so I concentrate on that. All the rest is, of course, other questions that can be raised, right? But what I was a bit surprised about your presentation, Stuart, about the cultural history of intoxication, and saying that it's only in the modern times that we have seen how intoxication has been tried to be controlled. For instance, your Greek example, your ancient Greek example, there were no slaves taking part, there were no women taking part, there were no children taking part, so they controlled and controlled and controlled the intoxication. If you go to the ritualistic use of drugs through history, it's a history of controlling intoxication. Telling who is allowed to use, what to use, how to behave, and things like that. So controlling intoxication and using drugs has always gone hand in hand. That is not a new thing. The only thing that is new is that we have, when we have states, then of course other kinds of agencies take over the control policy. But in, let's say, what you call the primitive societies, the control was really strong. So why should we talk about intoxication without talking about the parallel controlling of intoxication all the time? And we have a lot of controlling of intoxication right now. And there are no state telling us that we should behave the way we do when we drink alcohol now. The states say that they should control how they serve alcohol, but we are left on our own in how to control it. And we do. Not by yourself, not individually, but by looking at each other and seeing how should we behave here. So maybe the control aspect of intoxication is just as important as the need for intoxication or the benefits of intoxication.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No, I completely accept your point that the access to intoxicated states was very much about privileged bands of sectors within society. And you're quite right to say that the people who were considered the inferior layers of society were not included in the Eleusinian mysteries. And the same thing with other initiatory cults. The difference now, the qualitative difference between that and what we've got now, is that now nobody is allowed to do it. The attempt has been made in the last 100 years to say that this isn't about privileged elites anymore, unless it's the kind of military researchers that Lukáš was talking about. It's that no human being on Earth has the right to go into such states of consciousness. And control is important because, and self-control is absolutely vital. It's the only thing standing between us and dependency and dysfunctional use of intoxicants. And you're quite right that that becomes a socialized process. But the myth that the present legislative network has let itself get away with is encapsulated in the very phrase, controlled substances. What illegal substances are, of course, are anything but controlled. The trade in them isn't controlled to the extent that it's still everything, it's estimated that 90% of illegally trafficked drugs get to their point of destination, as compared with those that are intercepted and destroyed. And of course, there's no control whatsoever over the quality of what's sold. There's no licensing authority, there's no regulation. And those of us who argued for a decriminalized system, such as they have in Portugal, are saying that it's precisely an enlightened form of control that would be hugely beneficial now, rather than the anarchy of the black market, which is what we're otherwise living with. There used to be the case, when you put this argument classically 20 years ago, somebody would say, oh, so you think it would be all right for a 5-year-old child to walk into the pharmacy and buy heroin? No. Believe it or not, no one sensible has ever argued that. What we're saying is there would be the same sorts of licensing restriction that there currently are with alcohol.
We have to run.
Interesting discussion. Control. We think it is necessary, but not dictation. What he meant that the government are dictating on how to sell it. In Great Britain, recently, said from the television program that now the government is trying to set a limit of alcohol entity. That can be something that many countries can go after. Set up for within a week, make sure you don't consume more than that limit. And control, we need it. I think it is because we all live in the same country, for instance, and the budget is set. It's the addiction that this intoxication are involving. They spend a lot of money, and that is why we think it is necessary to control it. My question again is, you said the urine contains, it's very intoxicated. is it something that we can start thinking of when we try to get somebody from addiction? Give back the urine to drink so that the intoxication is still there and we get less. And my third question is, when a limit is given, it's not sold from the bar or from the chemist shop, how do you get it? You need to get it from somebody who has got more quantity.
Yes.
And how do they come across? How do they get that?
Yes.
Because we discover that here in Norway, people who doesn't want this alcohol, we say alcohol here in Norway, to end, they vote for the political party that is against it. Because the illegal people behind, they don't want this to end. The same thing goes for the drug.
I like the idea that you would have a state-controlled clinic that said, yes, you can have heroin, but only if you drink your own pee afterwards. Doesn't work with heroin. You mentioned the alcohol units. I'm sure this is an international system now. What are the safe limits for men and women in terms of intake of alcohol each week or each day? And they're wildly different estimates in different parts of the world. And I spoke to, when I was doing the research for my book, I spoke to a member of the British Medical Council who represents the controlling body that represents the whole medical profession in the UK. And he'd been on the original committee in the 1970s that came up with the first limits. And I said to him, how did you arrive at the figures, which were much more generous in those days than they are now? And he said, we plucked them out of thin air. They weren't based on any scientific calculation. We just guessed. We just thought what sounds about right. And they've been endlessly revised downwards ever since. Hardly anybody pays any attention to it anyway, other than noticing, with a sort of rueful accusation. Oh God, I've had 12 units tonight. How did that happen? But yes, no, it is all about. It's about who. An external authority telling you what it is, how to regulate your own intake and your own experience of things, is a model that doesn't really work.
Ja, veldig kort hvis det
I go back to the history again. The situation that you have a society where they have a lot of drugs are available, and you have the situation that some are only for few, some are for all, and some are for none. That seems to be very like the same situation that we have today. Alcohol is for all, even before over a age limit. It's legal to get intoxicated. Everybody are allowed to get intoxicated from alcohol. It's a change of mind. So it's nothing different about that. So my point is, what are really the difference? Because of course there is something that you are not allowed to take, something you are allowed to take, and that's exactly the same situation that you have today as you had in Greece, ancient Greece.
I don't believe it is. What's happening today is there is only one radical intoxicant left, which is alcohol. Everything else is prohibited. This was never the case even in classical societies. You're saying that there was a range of things that some people could take, and now there isn't a range. There's just alcohol. That's it. That's what's changed.
But the whole idea was that if you had a society where there was available a lot of drugs, only one could be allowed. The other ones was for a few people, and others were for none of them.
That's not the case.
So that was the case, for instance, in Western Africa, where they had a lot of beer for everyone.
Yes.
Only hash for some, and other drugs for none. So the same situation.
We're going to round up. I just want to ask Kenneth a question. you have been open about your experience with the psychedelic mushrooms, and if we look past that it's illegal, would you recommend other people to try to use psychedelic mushrooms?
Think carefully.
Are there any police officers present?
You
well,
won't know.
I see it.
Let's say if it became legal.
Some would say that it's an intellectual, philosophical, spiritual tool. You use it. You don't just, well, who am I to moralize? I think it should be legal for all those reasons, but actually recommending usage, I would say you shouldn't use it. Well, personally, I wouldn't use it just for partying and having fun. I would have a clear question or problem that I would want to work out before I used it. So, and it's not like you take it and then your problems are solved forever, but you go through it and there are all kinds of suggestions. Your mind works faster. You have so many more associations than you usually do. So I'm not going to make a recommendation. I'm going to say in general terms that it can be useful for certain purposes.
Thank you. So I think what we learned today is that different drugs have been a part of our history since the beginning of since the beginning of our time, and that drugs are not the same. We have different drugs, and they act in different ways, and not just the different drugs, but also on us. And that if you're going to use drugs, please use them carefully and be smart if you're going to use drugs. And I also think that maybe a conclusion is that the war on drugs haven't really been effective, and that if we want to prevent addiction and harm caused by drugs, we need to look at how we can make better societies, how we can work with harm reduction, and also contribute to a healthier drug culture. Could that be a conclusion for today?
That seems very fair.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you so much.